Before we count down a single truck, I need to be straight with you about the word returned, because it's carrying more weight than it can actually hold, and if I don't address that up front, everything else in this video would be built on a lie by omission. There is no return counter at a Ford or Ram or Chevy dealership. Once you sign and drive off the lot, that sale is final, no receipt, no 30-day window, no legal right to bring a truck back just because you changed your mind. The same way there's no legal right to return a house because the paint color looked different in person. So when a title like this one promises the most returned trucks in America, it isn't describing one clean official statistic that some government agency publishes every January, the way it publishes unemployment numbers or inflation data. It's describing three completely different things that all end with the same truck leaving its original owner earlier than planned, and tonight, I'm going to show you all three truck by truck using real numbers rather than a vague feeling pulled out of a comment section. The first path is the one that actually deserves the word return without any air quotes around it, a lemon law buyback. When a manufacturer can't fix the same documented defect after a reasonable number of attempts, typically 3 or 4 depending on the state law in most of the country forces that manufacturer to repurchase the vehicle outright, refund included, sometimes with attorney fees covered on top of that. That's a genuine return, initiated by the company under legal compulsion, not the customer walking in and asking nicely. The second path is repossession, voluntary or involuntary, where a lender takes the truck back because the loan behind it stopped getting paid, a financial failure rather than a mechanical one, though the two often travel together more than people realize. The third path is the one hiding inside most of the entries on this list, an unusually fast trade in or lease turn in, a truck that comes back to a dealer's lot within its first year, not because a court forced it, but because the owner simply couldn't live with it any longer and ate whatever loss came with walking away early rather than gambling on it getting better. None of these three things get published in a single combined ranking anywhere, which is exactly why so many videos with this exact title just make the list up entirely. Ranking trucks by vibes and comment section anecdotes dressed up as data. I'm not going to do that. Every truck on this countdown tonight is here because of a specific, documented, traceable reason it kept showing up in one of those three categories more than it should: recall filings, lawsuit records, negative equity data, and lemon law case counts, all pulled from sources that are current as of this year rather than recycled from an old article with the date quietly changed. And I want to be upfront about one more thing before we start. Some of these trucks will overlap with reliability problems you've heard about elsewhere, because a truck that breaks repeatedly and a truck that gets returned repeatedly are often, though not always, telling you the exact same underlying story from two different angles. Let's start with the mildest case on the list and build toward the one where an entire model line is currently working its way through actual literal buybacks right now this year while you're watching this. 12. Jeep Gladiator. The Gladiator earns its spot here through the slow, grinding version of a return rather than a dramatic one, an owner's patience finally running out rather than a single catastrophic failure forcing the issue in one dramatic afternoon that ends with a tow truck in the driveway. The truck shares its solid front axle with the Wrangler, the same architecture responsible for the death wobble, a violent shake through the steering that shows up when worn linkage hits a bump wrong at speed. And it shares the Wrangler's habit of a small auxiliary battery quietly draining the main one and leaving owners stranded with zero warning in a parking lot rather than anywhere convenient. Neither of those defects typically rises to the level of a forced lemon law buyback on its own, because each individual repair usually does succeed in fixing that specific instance, but stacked together across repeated dealer visits for different systems entirely, they're exactly the kind of accumulated frustration that shows up in early trade in data rather than in any single lawsuit. Owners who bought the truck for the open-air experience often find themselves negotiating with their own patience within the first 18 months, and a meaningful share of them simply cut their losses and traded in for something with fewer open recalls attached to the title, absorbing the depreciation hit rather than gambling on the next repair being the last one. It's a slow leak rather than a blowout, and slow leaks rarely make headlines even when they add up to real numbers over a full model year. 11. Nissan Titan. The Titan story isn't really about a defect. It's about a nameplate the company itself gave up on before most of its owners ever expected it to happen. A slow, quiet withdrawal, rather than a single dramatic announcement most people caught in real time. Nissan wound down Titan production back in 2024 because almost nobody was buying them. And once a truck becomes an orphan, resale values start sliding specifically because buyers get nervous about a discontinued nameplate with a thinning dealer network and a shrinking parts supply that only gets thinner with every passing year. That nervousness shows up directly in early trade-in behavior, and it compounds on itself the way any panic in a small market tends to. Owners who bought a Titan in its final production years, sometimes without fully realizing the end was coming until the announcement hit the news, have been trading in earlier than average specifically to get out ahead of the resale cliff, rather than waiting for it to get worse and finding themselves competing with every other nervous owner at the same time. It's a return driven entirely by financial anxiety rather than mechanical failure, and it's arguably the most avoidable entry on this entire list, since the underlying 5.6-liter V8 remains an honest, durable engine that simply lost its corporate backing through no fault of its own engineering. The tragedy of the Titan's spot on this list is that the truck itself did nothing wrong. The market simply decided it no longer wanted to find out whether it would keep being right about that. 10. Ford Super Duty with the Power Stroke Diesel. This is where the list stops being about annoyance and starts being about genuine financial catastrophe landing on a single owner all at once, with no warning and no gradual buildup to soften the blow. The high-pressure fuel pump on these diesels was engineered around cleaner, more lubricating fuel than what typically comes out of a pump in the United States. And starved of that lubrication, it can grind itself into metal shavings and push them straight through the rest of the fuel system, contaminating injectors and lines along the way like sand poured directly into a running engine. When that failure happens on a truck that's still relatively new, the repair bill regularly runs into 5 figures. And for a meaningful number of owners, the math simply doesn't work in favor of keeping the truck once they've seen that invoice with their own eyes. Rather than absorb a repair bill that size a second time, owners have been trading these trucks in at a loss specifically to escape a fuel system they no longer trust, even when the rest of the truck is otherwise sound and the engine itself runs perfectly fine once the pump is replaced. It's not a lemon law case, because the defect doesn't always repeat on the same truck the way a manufacturing flaw would, but it's a documented pattern of owners voting with their signature on a trade-in form rather than risk the pump failing a second time on a highway somewhere far from home. The truck itself, once repaired, often runs fine for years afterward with no repeat of the same failure. It's the memory of that first invoice and the fear of a second one that ends up driving the decision to walk away rather than risk it happening twice on the same truck. 9. Chevrolet Colorado and GMC Canyon. Same platform, same plant, same headaches, so they share a single slot on this list the way they share nearly everything else down to the interior trim and the switchgear. The most alarming issue here is a genuine safety defect, cold weather conditions that cause the electronic brake assist system to fail and force the truck into a hard limp mode capped around 43 miles an hour. Exactly the kind of malfunction nobody wants happening on an icy on-ramp with traffic pressing in behind them and nowhere to safely pull over. Safety defects tied to braking systems are precisely the category most likely to trigger a manufacturer buyback rather than a simple repair. Because a brake system that fails once under specific conditions is very hard to certify as fixed to a nervous owner's satisfaction, especially one with young kids riding in the back seat every winter morning. Add a torque converter shutter in the 8-speed automatic and software updates that have been quietly draining the 12-volt battery overnight, and you get a truck generating an outsized share of both dealer buyback inquiries and early voluntary trade-ins relative to how many units GM actually sold in this particular segment. 2 nameplates, 1 platform, and a single shared list of complaints that shows up in both brands' service records at nearly identical rates. 8. GMC Sierra 2500 HD and Chevrolet Silverado 2500 HD. Heavy-duty trucks are bought specifically to work without complaint, which makes this pairing's specific failure mode especially damaging to owner trust in a way lighter-duty complaints rarely manage to replicate. Diesel models paired with the Allison transmission have shown harsh, jarring shift lag. And the exhaust after-treatment system has developed a habit of clogging its particulate filters and failing its urea injectors, dropping the truck into a severely restricted limp mode on the way to the dealer, often with a loaded trailer still attached and nowhere convenient to drop it. Layer on top of that a recall covering a trailer brake module that can overheat, melt, and in the worst documented cases, catch fire on a truck engineered specifically to spend its life towing. And you have exactly the combination of a safety defect plus a work-disrupting mechanical failure that pushes commercial buyers in particular toward demanding a buyback rather than accepting another round of warranty repairs that keep the truck parked instead of earning money. Fleet buyers in particular have far less patience for a truck that can't reliably finish a tow. And fleet contracts often include return provisions that individual retail buyers simply don't have access to, which means a meaningful share of this pairing's early exits happen through channels an ordinary owner never even sees. A truck that costs a fleet company money every day it sits in a service bay gets pulled from service far faster than a truck sitting in a single family's driveway ever would. 7. Ford F-150. The best-selling vehicle in America earns a spot here not because of one defect, but because of sheer volume interacting with an extraordinary recall year that dwarfs anything the industry has ever posted before. A genuinely unprecedented number for a company that's been building trucks for well over a century. Ford issued 153 separate recalls in 2025, nearly double the previous industry record, touching almost 13 million vehicles. And this year has already added tens of millions more recall notices on top of that, including a single campaign covering more than 4 million F-Series trucks specifically. Most of those recalls get resolved with a simple software flash or a dealer visit rather than a formal buyback, and the truck itself has genuinely improved enough that Consumer Reports just named it a top pick for the first time since 2019. But at that volume, even a tiny percentage translating into genuine, repeated, unfixable defects still adds up to thousands of real cases. And Ford's own transmission complaints, harsh shifts, and delayed engagement on the 10-speed automatic have generated an actual class action lawsuit, specifically because a subset of owners couldn't get the problem to stay fixed no matter how many times they brought it back in for the exact same complaint. Scale changes everything about a statistic like this. A defect rate that would be invisible on a niche model becomes a genuine consumer protection story once it's spread across a truck. This popular selling in numbers, most of the rest of this list can only dream about matching in a single model year. 6. Ford F-150 Lightning. This one is almost entirely a financial story rather than a mechanical one, and it might be the purest example of the third category on tonight's list. The rapid, voluntary early trade and driven by pure anxiety, rather than a broken part sitting under the hood somewhere. Ford discontinued the Lightning late last year after billions in losses across its electric vehicle division, and owners watching that announcement land have been trading their trucks in at a noticeably accelerated rate ever since, trying to get out ahead of a resale value that's already dropped by more than half in some cases, before it drops even further. An early battery recall tied to a cell defect that could short and start a fire didn't help matters. Nor did the discovery that towing anything meaningful collapses the truck's range hard, a rough surprise for a vehicle marketed specifically around its towing capability. None of this typically qualifies as a lemon law case because the truck usually does what it's supposed to do most of the time when you're not actively worried about it. It's simply that owning a discontinued electric truck from a company that's publicly walked away from the whole category creates exactly the kind of anxiety that turns into an early trade and appointment before the value drops any further than it already has. Fear of a falling number turns out to be just as powerful a motivator as an actual broken part. 5. GMC Hummer EV. The Hummer EV combines nearly every category on this list into one nameplate, and it's the first genuinely catastrophic entry we've reached tonight. The point where the list stops describing frustration and starts describing real financial and legal consequences that follow an owner around for years. The truck weighs somewhere around 9,000 pounds, and it depreciates accordingly, with real documented examples of trucks that stickered well into six figures changing hands for a fraction of that within a couple of years, sometimes with only a few hundred miles on the odometer. But the more serious issue is mechanical rather than financial. Owners have reported battery packs failing more than once within the first several thousand miles. And when a battery fails a second time on the same truck after a first repair, that's precisely the pattern that triggers a genuine lemon law buyback rather than a voluntary trade-in, because the manufacturer has now had a fair chance to fix it and failed twice. Multiple Hummer EV owners have already gone through that exact process, handing the truck back to General Motors and receiving a refund, real returns in the strictest legal sense of the word, on a vehicle that cost more than most houses did a generation ago and was supposed to represent the pinnacle of the brand's electric ambitions. It's hard to imagine a more literal example of the word return sitting anywhere else on this entire list. 4. Tesla Cybertruck. Where this one lands on the list depends entirely on which specific defect you're talking about, because there have been so many that it's genuinely hard to keep track without a spreadsheet dedicated entirely to this one nameplate. Roughly 8 to 10 recalls in about 2 years, covering exterior trim panels that could peel off and fly away on the highway due to failing adhesive, an accelerator pedal that could come loose and jam wide open, and most recently, brake rotors that could crack around the wheel studs. In the worst case, leading to a wheel separating from the truck entirely while it's moving. That last defect in particular, a wheel separation risk, is squarely in the category regulators and manufacturers treat as too dangerous to simply patch and move on from, and it's produced a documented wave of owners specifically requesting buybacks rather than accepting another repair on a truck they no longer trust to keep all 4 wheels attached. Layer on a resale value that's collapsed by roughly a third in the first year alone, and sales that dropped by nearly half year over year, and you have a truck generating both voluntary early exits and involuntary manufacturer repurchases at the same time, from 2 completely different groups of owners for 2 completely different reasons. Few vehicles in automotive history have managed to combine that much financial anxiety with that much genuine mechanical concern inside a single nameplate this quickly, barely 2 years after the truck's first delivery to an actual customer. 3. Toyota Tundra. This is the one that should genuinely surprise you because Toyota's entire brand identity is built on the idea that this specific list doesn't apply to them. Decades of advertising and word of mouth built around exactly the opposite reputation. The truck your uncle bought specifically because he never wanted to think about this exact video again. The twin-turbo 3.4-liter V6 in the redesigned Tundra has been dogged by main-bearing failures, oil pressure collapsing to zero, and the engine seizing, sometimes at highway speed, traced back to manufacturing debris left inside the block during assembly. Toyota has now been through this exact recall more than once, and troublingly, a meaningful number of replacement engines installed under that recall have gone on to fail the identical way, leaving owners who thought they'd finally gotten the fixed version staring at the same warning light a second time. When a warranty repair fails a second time using the manufacturer's own approved fix, that's the textbook definition of what state lemon laws were written to address, and Tundra owners have been filing exactly those claims, forcing Toyota into genuine buybacks on a truck built by a company that spent 50 years convincing America this specific outcome couldn't happen to them, only to watch it happen anyway on its flagship full-size truck. The badge that was supposed to be the exception has become, on this specific engine, just one more example of the rule. 2. The GM 6.2-liter V8, known as the L87. This is the story that's still actively unfolding in courtrooms as you watch this, and it's gotten worse, not better, since it first made headlines a couple of years ago, a rare case of a recall aging badly instead of quietly fading out of the news cycle. General Motors recalled close to 600,000 trucks and SUVs carrying this engine over a manufacturing defect in the connecting rods and crankshaft bearings that can cause sudden total engine seizure, sometimes with only a few thousand miles on the odometer. No warning knock, no check engine light, just silence where the engine used to be. The remedy for engines that passed inspection was thicker oil, and owners are still reporting engines seizing after receiving that exact fix. In some cases, barely over 1,000 miles past the repair, a number that shouldn't exist if the fix actually worked as advertised. Multiple lawsuits have since been consolidated into a single federal case, and this past January, regulators opened an entirely new inquiry specifically to determine whether trucks that already went through the recall are failing all over again. General Motors is asking a court to dismiss the case, arguing the recall already solved the problem, while the regulator investigating it doesn't sound nearly as convinced. In the meantime, individual Silverado and Sierra owners have been pursuing lemon law buybacks case by case, and a growing number of them are winning actual trucks, actual refunds, on an engine still sitting under hundreds of thousands of hoods on the road right now, quietly ticking along in driveways across the country. Nobody knows exactly how many more of those hoods will eventually join the same lawsuit, which is precisely the kind of uncertainty that keeps this story near the top of any honest version of tonight's list, rather than settling into a tidy closed chapter the way most recalls eventually do. 1. Ram 1500. And here's where this list lands, on a truck that occupies an almost impossible position in the industry right now, crowned the most dependable large pickup in America by one major survey just months before a completely different, equally respected survey handed it the single worst reliability score any pickup has ever received in that publication's history, an almost apocalyptic result for a truck wearing a crown from the other end of the industry entirely. A keyless entry system with a parasitic drain quietly kills the battery overnight, cascading into electrical faults across the truck by morning. The new Hurricane Twin Turbo Inline 6 has been linked to melted catalytic converters and coolant working its way into the intake, either of which can end in complete engine failure without much warning. Even owners who specifically chose the returning Hemi V8 to avoid the new engine's growing pains have reported broken exhaust manifold bolts and a lifter tick that's followed that engine for years, proof that dodging one engine's problems doesn't necessarily dodge the truck's problems entirely. A stack a recall for trailer brake modules that can catch fire, and another for dashboard screens going dark on top of all of that. And you get a truck generating documented cases across all three categories on tonight's list at once. Lemon law buybacks from owners who couldn't get repeat defects fixed, repossessions tied to the same negative equity crisis hitting the entire truck market this year, and voluntary early trade-ins from owners who simply stopped trusting the badge on the tailgate, whatever survey happened to be sitting in the glove box when they signed the loan. No other truck on this list manages to touch all three categories at once quite this thoroughly, which is exactly why it closes out the countdown. The honest takeaway. Now I have to complicate every single one of these because that's the deal on this channel, and a list built on 3 stitched-together data sources deserves the same scrutiny. I just gave 12 different trucks one at a time, rather than a victory lap at the end. None of the 12 trucks you just heard about has an official published return rate, because no such number exists anywhere in the industry. No government agency, no trade group, nobody keeping a single master spreadsheet. What I've actually shown you tonight is a pattern stitched together from 3 real but separate data sources: recall filings and their associated lawsuits, negative equity concentration by model, and documented lemon law case counts pulled from state consumer protection records. And that pattern is genuinely informative. But it isn't the same thing as a single clean statistic a government agency verified and published with a press release attached to it, the way a title implying exactly that kind of official ranking wants you to assume walking in. It's also worth saying plainly that most owners of every single truck on this list are driving around right now with no problems at all, and a recall or a lawsuit filing describes a subset of a subset, not the average experience of the average buyer who signed the same paperwork you're considering signing this week. Ford's staggering recall count partly reflects a company casting a wider net and moving faster on smaller issues than it used to, which is a genuinely different story than an engine quietly seizing with no warning at all, and treating every recall as equally alarming flattens a distinction that actually matters quite a bit to anyone standing in a dealership trying to make a decision. And it's worth remembering that a truck showing up on a negative equity or early trade-in list often says as much about the loan wrapped around it, an 84-month term, a thin down payment, a rate that never should have been approved in the first place, as it does about the truck itself sitting underneath all that financing, a distinction that gets lost the moment a scary headline flattens both stories into one number. The two stories, financial and mechanical, get tangled together in exactly the way this list has been untangling them tonight, one truck at a time, one category at a time, rather than lumping every kind of early exit into a single alarming headline number. Some of these trucks are genuinely fighting their own engineering. Others are simply fighting the math of a loan that was never built to survive contact with real life, a job change, a medical bill, an insurance premium that jumped without warning. The honest takeaway is that before you sign anything, you should ask which specific category actually worries you. A repeat defect a court would recognize as a genuine lemon, a loan structured to outlast your patience long before the truck itself gives out, or a resale value about to fall off a cliff the moment a headline like this one gets published. Because those are three different problems, built by three different parts of this industry, and they deserve three different questions before you ever walk onto a lot and start negotiating over a truck you haven't fully researched yet.